Welcome. Hello, everyone. This is the webinar series for the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Work Group. We're part of the National Water Quality Monitoring Council, and the council works to bring together federal, state, tribal, and local water professionals, nonprofits, folks in academia, as well as volunteer citizen scientists to provide a voice for water quality monitoring practitioners across the nation and foster increased understanding and stewardship of our water resources. My name is Sylvia Lee. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am a biologist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency based in Washington, D.C. Currently, though, I'm working remotely from the traditional lands of the Apalachicola in the northern part of what is now known as the state of Florida. And I'm here today in my role as co-chair of the JEDI work group of the NWQMC. And also here with us today is my fellow co-chair, Nick Martirano, who will be introducing today's speaker. And I want to leave as much time as possible for the presentation and discussion. So I'll be putting some links in the chat to check out if you would like to learn more about the council. These are the links you see on the slide here as well, as a way to stay connected with us, whatever your preferred method of communication is, such as our social media accounts or by email. And then I just wanted to mention, after the presentation and questions for the speakers, we would love for anyone to briefly share about your project or an upcoming event related to JEDI and water quality. We're hoping to compile a list of these projects so that we can share inspiration and knowledge and to build connections with each other to create positive change. So without further ado, I want to welcome the speakers and Nick to introduce our speaker. Please take it away.
Thanks, Sylvia. As he brings up his slide deck, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and our speaker today. My name is Nick Martirano. I am, pronouns are he, him. I work for the State Water Resources Control Board. I'm currently working on the lands of the ancestral lands of the Miwok, Patwan, and Nisenan peoples up in Sacramento, California. I work in the Office of Information Management Analysis. I've been working there for about 5 years as the director for the California Water Quality Monitoring Council, and I'm also the EPA Region 9 member on the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. And I've been really lucky to work for our guest speaker today, Greg Gearheart. He's the Deputy Director for the Office of Information Management Analysis and has been working on racial equity for probably the better part of his life, but in his career for the last 4 or 5 years at the CalEPA, and has been really a key mentor and educator in this space for me. So I was really happy that he agreed to kick off this great webinar series. There's also Jamie Hoon from the California Recycle. I don't know if it's the board, actually, Cal Recycle is what we call it, and she's been our communication specialist for our racial equity work within the CalEPA as well. So she's here in backup, and we'll be putting in some links in the chat too. But with that, and in recognition of time, I'll go ahead and kick it off to Greg Gearheart.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, Nick. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for doing the work that you do. So Jamie, Wen, and I are representing a CalEPA organization that, so within the state of California, we have, typical cabinets and secretary level things. And so we have an agency called the Environmental Protection Agency. And one of the board's departments and offices in there is the Department of Recycling and Recovery. No, you have a more complicated name these days, Jamie. And then the water boards. And the water board and the recycling and the air board and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, pesticide regulation, and toxics all make up this family. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the CalEPA organization has been doing for the last 3-4 years. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about what the Water Board is doing in the last year, and sprinkling in some content that I think will be helpful for framing the work that we all do together, and recognizing that it is this intersection of this long-winded title that I have here, where data, water quality data in particular, but not just water quality data, and racial equity and environmental justice and other things all sort of intersect into this space of how and why we do the work. So bear with me as I try to do this of an overview of an organizational effort, as well as sprinkle in some things that are a bit more provocative and thoughtful, hopefully, for people. So for grounding purposes, and let me just say, so my title is Deputy Director for Information Management and Analysis, and that's a big mouthful, but we're an office of about 30 at the State Water Board that does data engagement and monitoring work. And as a result of that, we've sort of found our place to be advancing racial equity, in many cases tribal data initiatives around the water quality data that we manage that makes its way to the Water Quality Exchange, Storette. We call it CEDN in California, but we have lots of intersections of data, but that's really what we've sort of decided to do. My background, I went to Humboldt State University many years ago, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt. And I got a degree in environmental engineering and worked at the water boards for my whole career. So I'm in like 28 years of water board work in California, doing lots of different things across the organization. So for grounding, I want to talk about some of these key terms and make sure that as I sort of go through the rest of the presentation, there's some common understanding of it. And so one of the things that we spend actually 6 hours of talking about is the work of advancing racial equity. And the most important things on this slide that I think that are important to sort of take home without having to give the whole presentation is that we center on race because you could just call it equity, you could call it social equity, you could call it fiscal equity. There's lots of other people that want to call it other things and they don't want to talk about race, but really this practice of using the term racial equity as a collective term is because by centering on these most vulnerable, overburdened, and marginalized communities, you're really doing the most important work of providing the government service. And you're also recognizing the historic role the government did play in establishing some of these institutions that now have built into systems that continue to deliver outcomes today that are based on those original racist ideologies. So we're not here to talk about individual racism that's happening necessarily on a daily basis or not around us. This is really sort of based on this historic role of government and the fact that as representatives of current government services, we have a responsibility to kind of link our arms and our work together with other government entities, departments that have similar overlap to deliver better outcomes. And this intersectionality and all the work that we do around racial equity is really, it's really based on that fundamental idea. And I think it's helpful to sort of keep that top of mind. Data equity and data sovereignty are things that are going to come up too. So in our work, in particular, the council's work and the work that we do in California in my office, it's very data centric. And I'll get to reasons that I think that that's important later. But with that in mind, I think we have an important role to play of making our data more accessible. Data accessibility used to be, do you have good metadata and did you make it published as open data? And we're now sort of morphing our thought in California around water data to make sure that we're ensuring that it's accessible beyond language barriers, that it's accessible in ways that has context that's written in plain language so that it's not metadata-ese written in our own language and things like that. And then importantly, the data sovereignty concept is really top of mind in California today, especially with tribes and the tribal data. It's really important to understand that it's their data, and when it's a sovereign country, essentially, it literally really is their data, and there's legal policies and legal practices that need to be put into place to ensure that we're honoring that sovereignty. There's a really good metaphor to be made, in my opinion, or extending that idea to any community of data. And so like city areas, urban areas, perhaps in California that aren't, they were historically tribal, but they're not currently recognized as tribal. it's still their data. And so we still have a lot to learn from this data sovereignty work that's being done around the world. I'll talk a little bit about the environmental movement. I don't need to with this crowd, but we're in this metamorphosis. I like to say that we're not actually replacing environmental justice with racial equity. We're not replacing climate justice with racial equity work. We're not replacing some of the original program missions with racial equity work. We're evolving, and we're kind of metamorphizing and rewrapping some of these things, learning from the practices that worked and the things that didn't work. And one of the things that's important about the difference between racial equity and environmental justice has to do with not putting the burden of delivering environmental justice on a single person's title or an office. And there's been a lot of really good research in the last 10 years about how government, through good intentions, ended up sort of isolating and creating a new silo called environmental justice. So racial equity is intentional in the sense that the work that we're doing is trying to not do that, learn from that experience so that we don't just create a new pillar called racial equity. It's really meant to be a larger wrapper, and even larger than environmental justice. We're really intending to make sure that the work that our government entities around environmental laws do is supportive of and synergistic with the work that other departments' missions are, like health and education and law enforcement and justice and transportation, et cetera. So it's really trying to learn and grow bigger and not replace. So there is a shiny object syndrome theory out there of we just keep doing something new every few years. And I actually see it differently. I see that we're doing the same work, but we keep learning and sort of putting new wrappers and try new initiatives, and we iterate. Just like any good project, we try things, we fail at some areas, then we keep working. So water equity is just this idea of, because it's such a vital public trust resource, and there is whether you recognize it legally or not, a human right to water, we all need it, that it sort of rises to a level of equity term of its own. And so we're, again, we're not saying we've defined it and figured it out, but there are definitely some good resources and work being done. And this is larger than water quality, obviously. So amongst all these different sort of terms, there are some common elements here. So I would say one of the most important elements and pillars for me in getting to this point has been a constant practice of learning more about systems thinking and applying systems thinking and seeing the world through the systems lens. And so I think that's really, really valuable stuff. I don't know if that translates to everyone, and I don't know if everyone sort of sees it the same way, but once I started doing that about 10, 15 years ago in my career, it just changed the way that I had relationships, the way I measured progress towards change, and the way that I saw the world, because that is kind of how the world works, is through these systems. This historic role of government is, again, really instrumental. I'll talk about that later with pollution and prejudice and a project that we did in California. The difference between equity and equality is really important to sort of tease out, and I was getting at that with some of the work or use of institution and systemic racism. It really is about achieving an outcome. There's actually on the spectrum of moving from the word equality in the 60s and 70s and 80s to now more of terms of equity in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010, and even most recently. And then there's actually this next phase that is being talked about as belonging, and this idea that really, equity still implies a little bit of, it invites an argument about unfairness. Belonging is really that sort of higher level of where we're all headed towards, I think. So we'll probably see terms shift again here in the next 5 years. And then the idea of centering on your vulnerable communities and your members of those communities, it really is, it's intersectional. So, we had a great keynote speaker at one of our events who's a Black trans woman who really caught that and explained that concept really well. And we could probably drop the YouTube of Ebony speaking about that, but it's really important to understand that it is intersectional. But at the end of the day, the race factor is probably one of the most common drivers when you sort of get to that bottom layer of what's causing this inequities it's usually some form of institutional or systemic racism, and it's that R word that is really important. So using data to drive, and then the fact that this data does belong to the people that you're trying to serve. So shifting gears now that we have this maybe common terminology discussion underway, the CalEPA and the water boards as part of the CalEPA has been advancing racial equity for a while. And we have a team, and the team was formed in 2018, and it was under this rubric called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And there's many other members of the network now, but in 2018, there was not a lot of state governments doing it. And in California, they formed a cohort, and the CalEPA departments joined. And we formed these, we wrote a plan, it's called a Plan to Achieve Racial Equity. And we wrote that in 2019, and we broke it into these categories of work that were common across every board, department, and office. So recall that we have air, toxics, water, things like that, right? So we needed to figure out a way to write a racial equity plan that was kind of uniform across everyone's work. So the language access was a very common problem that needed to be addressed. So there was a team formed on that. There was a team that dealt with workforce capacity, meaning can we normalize? This whole work is built on a model of change that sort of the first step is to normalize, kind of like what I just did. Can we have some terminology that we start using together so that we don't argue about what it means? And the training component is huge. The water boards alone have 2,600 employees. We've done maybe about 500 of our employees in our 6-hour course. And so we have a lot more to go. We now have a train the trainer program too within CalEPA. We have 23 certified trainers and about, I think, 5 or 6 master trainers that are available to create new certified trainers. We have a curriculum. We have a team that sort of reviews a curriculum. We have this machinery set up now that it took us 2 years to build, which is pretty incredible. A third area that the team works on is called workforce equity. Workforce equity is looking at the flow of our people that work at the CalEPA. So all the way from before recruitment, like the pipelines that feed into, potential jobs, how we announce those jobs, the recruitment stage, how do we describe the work? How do we do our outreach? How do we do the evaluation and selection process of applicants that actually choose to apply? And then how do we retain? How do we promote? And then even we talk a little bit about succession planning. So it's really that whole life cycle of the workforce. And we have a guide that is really interesting on our website. We also have a data team that is dedicated to supporting all the other teams. And they've broken their work into some areas that I'll talk more about later. So I won't go into too much detail here, but these links will all be available to you. And then the 5th team is the comms team, and that's the team that Jamie leads. And the comms team is really important to sort of keep the communication lines going, especially during times of change and transition. You can see by this slide that a lot has happened over the last, these are the first 3 years really, but 2021 and 2022 just expanded the number of people doing this kind of work, the number of opportunities and committees that people have to attend outside of their normal duties. And so the communications part is absolutely vital, and it is a common thread throughout all of this. So the CalEPA story, don't need to go into too much detail on this slide, but know that it started out as a relatively small team. It grew into 2 teams the second year, and then came back to sort of like being 1 team in the 3rd year. And then in 2021, the events, the summer of 2020 events, every board, department, and office established kind of their own. And so we're now in this new mode of every board, department, and office is doing their own. And this is kind of reflected here on this slide, where from the org chart, you can see, we have these 6 boards, departments, and offices below. This is not up to date. Literally every department on here. And there's the name, Department of Resources, Recycling, and Recovery, also known as CalRecycle. So they actually have a team. So like this just needs to be updated. I apologize. The work that we did included products. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the products here. The language access services dealing with linguistic isolation has a draft set of guidance that's going through its final review, both at the water board and at the CalEPA level. We have this workforce equity practices document that has some analysis of the workforce demographics inside that I'll talk about. We did a really, really cool deep dive project for a year plus on the topic of pollution and prejudice, looking at that intersection of redlining and pollution data, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then we continue to produce new products. There's lots of training products out. As I mentioned, we've really focused on developing an internal engine to do workforce capacity building. So the role of workforce equity in everything is critical. It should not be the limit of what we do, but if it's sort of like the concept of if you can't take care of your own house, then how are you going to take care of the whole neighborhood and the community? And we have a role to play, and we reflect the communities that we serve, or we don't reflect the communities that we serve. And that plays a factor in how well we do our jobs. And so this idea of workforce equity is vital to any government entity going through an initiative to advance racial equity. And many of the tools and things you'll hear about, like using a root cause analysis or using a results-based accountability process, these are terms that are used in these larger efforts. The Government Alliance on Race and Equity, as I mentioned, I'll have lots of links available if people want them to click on and to look at some of these things if your organization is in some stage of looking and needing some of this information. So as I mentioned, the data lifecycle and the workforce lifecycle are somewhat reflected in our plan right now in our practices document. We don't have all the data we need. We certainly don't have good data on the pipelines of people coming into potential jobs that intersect with our job classifications. We don't have data on recruitment, very, very good data. We don't know who didn't apply. We don't know who, in many cases, we don't know who applied and was screened out because of human resources looking at their qualifications. And, there's lots of bias opportunities along that way. Have some really horror stories that I can tell you about people that are highly qualified to do the work, but someone in a human resources position said that doesn't count as that kind of a classification. So there's lots of data gaps, but one of the data pieces that we do have is looking at who is working at the workforces in each department in California. And this is really interesting data to describe the department. When your department is really big like ours, 2,600 employees though, you end up getting questions about how does my division look, or how does my branch look, or my field office over here, because everyone feels like they're a little bit different. But this data set that I'm going to describe is being collected in California as part of the mandatory human resources process. So at the beginning of your employment, you're given this form. You're asked to identify yourself if you want. If you choose not to identify, that's fine. You check that box. I'll get to that later. That goes into the system as a blank, essentially. And at some point, someone has to decide what that is, because our reports are census-based. They're not survey-based. It's 100% of the employees have to fall into some category. And so there is this awkward and problematic step where somebody in a state office makes a determination on someone's identity. And this is just a slide deck that we use to talk in more detail about that, but there's lots of there's a lot more options here. You may notice that there's more choices than are available in the US Census data. So we'll get to that in a minute too. But this is what California uses. Every department does it the same way. When you start looking at the report, we had to do some data munging and remodeling to get the data to work better. And when we did that, we were able to get this machine readable data that allows us to take a view of the demographics data and compare it to the rest of the California community using the census data. So this is an example. I'm going to walk you through one of our data tools that we developed. We have a repo on GitHub that has the transforms codes in R available that allow you to sort of put our California data through a transformation step that allows you to compare it to the census data. And then we also have some built-in reports that have different charts and different kinds of analytics. And I'll go through what that looks like. So this is an example of one department. So you see up at the top, SWRCB. So that's, as I mentioned, that's one of the 6 within CalEPA. You could also look at this. In fact, the full report and slide deck that this is borrowed from, it has the whole CalEPA, and then it drills down to each one of these boards, departments, and offices and does the same sort of analytical comparison. At the highest level, it'll do Black, Indigenous people of color as a whole and compare that to the California Black, Indigenous people of color threshold values. And then the next level down is it breaks down that Black, Indigenous people of color into these categories you see here. So this is the sort of the data magic that we had to do to make comparable categories between California's workforce data and the US Census data. But this is now at the State Water Board versus the state population. You can see that there's some differences. The next level that this report goes, and each one of these is a step. I'm just showing you the sort of most granular level here. This step now breaks that workforce into 4 large buckets. So we took the whole 2,600 approximately employees at the Water Board, and we broke them into large buckets that include administrative occupations, legal occupations, technical occupations, and management occupations. There's some other ones. You'll notice that this doesn't add up to 2,600, but these are the big ones that we thought would sort of be like a good index of the Water Board. Management captures who gets promoted for the most part or hired at a higher level. And then administrative tends to often reflect the demographics because there's so many more broad classifications and entry points for people in administrative kinds of functions. Legal is probably one of the more difficult ones to have a conversation around reflecting the communities that we serve. And so we sort of put that in there as a extreme, like an outlier kind of a category. And then technical really gets at this, look at the number there. That's like the bulk. More than half of the people at the Water Board work in what we call a technical occupation. That's engineers, scientists, geologists, chemists, toxicologists, people like that. And so this was also really important for us to sort of look at. So the magic behind this slide is that there's really cool scripts available for people who can use them and modify them that would help you turn your data into something that can be compared to American Community Survey and or US Census data when the data is out. So again, there's lots of ways to look at this data. This is just an interesting way to start conversations. What we haven't done in California yet is figure out exactly how to roll that kind of a data analysis of workforce into planning and actual hiring. We have constitutional barriers to saying that we're going to target and set targets for race-based recruitment. We can't do that in California. Maybe other states can, but that's a huge barrier to being explicit about it. So we're trying to figure out how to work that in. We also are doing this workforce survey that's it's not a census, and it doesn't really ask people to identify themselves per se. It's more about measuring this normalizing step. How far along on that change model is your organization? And so we have done one of these, and we're about to do our second one. It's every 2 years survey. We ended up getting, I think it was about 800 people at the Water Boards out of our 2,600 that responded. So you can see that it's a different animal than a census. You have to sort of make a lot of assumptions or extrapolations about what the results mean, especially when you're starting to look at parts of your organization. But we're hopeful that we'll get more turnout and use these over time. You're supposed to every 2 years measure your progress. You can see just by me saying that the expectation is that this will take probably decades of transforming. I'll be retired, other people's kids will be working in this field, and they'll still be working on this idea. They'll be calling it something different, but this will take a long time. It took a long time to build the institutions that turned into the systems delivering racist outcomes today. And so it's going to take a long time, if you think about it, to unbuild and to build new systems. So that's the GitHub. We have some other data areas where we're working on that I want to cover. This is the one that I mentioned on pollution. The first project that we worked on was to take data from our environmental justice data screening tool called CalEPA. It's very similar to US EPA's EJ screen, very similar and different in some ways. But at the end of the day, we used the California one, and we actually used the 3.0 version. There's now a 4.0 version. And we're going to update, I think, our products at some point. But what we decided to work on as a research question was, redlining occurred in California like it did in many states. It only occurred in sort of 6 major urban areas, not as like broad because California wasn't this big in the 40s when it started. But during the late 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even into like the early 60s, this work of segregation by way of land use control and housing availability, it generally was referred to as redlining, but it had lots of different components. And so we thought if you took those polygons over time and look at the current environmental justice screening data and look at them today, essentially, you'd have this interesting view of how big of a lock and sort of baked in effect did that redlining have back in the time when the redlining occurred. So that's the name of that's the gist of the project. The name is Pollution and Prejudice. It's a story map in ArcGIS Esri product platform. We also have a hub that's available because a lot of great work's been done by Jamie and others to advance the pollution and prejudice. Jamie was one of the lead researchers. Jamie Wynn here today was one of the lead researchers on that project, as were others that have also done amazing continued work. So this is a really cool open science project that is in its transition stage to the next phase. A quick view at the data behind it. This is also a tool that we used to do some of the work in the analysis. This is written in RShiny, and we'll give you the URL, but essentially you can take these areas of California that were given red line classifications, the Housing and Loan Corporation established this rating system for risk, mortgage risk, and it's ABCD, also known as colors, and the red color reflects the highest risk. So you take an area that has these polygon shapes and you start comparing it to these CalEnviroscreen threshold values. And the analysis that was done in the final pollution and prejudice story map is on that second tab across the top. It says Redline CES analysis. This other view that you're looking at right now is a data explorer view that's also really cool. You can start dropping in facility information. In theory, we could also integrate water quality data. One of the index values in CalEnviroscreen is impaired water bodies. And so there's a lot of different things that we could throw at a map like this to sort of start doing exploratory work. And then the analysis is fascinating, and I'll let people who did it describe it better. But oops, let me go back, and I'll basically say that we also did, in addition to the R analysis that produced some association kinds of results, we also have a lot of great work done in ArcGIS. And so, as I mentioned, this will be updated with the CalEnviroscreen 4.0 data. We're also talking about expanding the open research project to allow parts of California that want to drill deeper. We did a statewide analysis for all of California, but somebody may want to go into like Stockton area and really do a more fine-grain analysis of what's happening both there, maybe over time, with different data sets that we didn't consider. So that's where we're headed with a project that's going to get announced here in the next few months. We're using a process called OpenScapes. If you've heard of the National Science Foundation funded project, it's part of the NC's effort out of UC Santa Barbara, and it's called OpenScapes, and it's a whole workflow data sharing kind of approach to doing this kind of partner teamwork. A third area of data is on the topic of engagement. We know that we're going to have continued work amongst all the boards, departments, and offices doing engagement. This could be a program. You know, I know that I haven't talked a lot about water quality data, but I'm showing you that the backbone of this is applicable to almost any kind of a sub-program. So if you work in wetlands, if you do confined animal facility operations kind of work, or if you are underground storage tank related, you're going to be out there interfacing with communities. You're going to have a workforce demographics component to the work that you do. And then you're going to take that program lens and filter, and you're going to really apply it. This is a tool that we developed with that in mind, so that, in fact, any department in California could make use of this tool right now. It doesn't even have an environmental focus to it. This is the ability to look at the census data and maybe other data sets that we can bring in, like our Department of Education data about languages spoken at home. And you could go to a community and you would be able to get a quick view of what that community is isolated around, like what are their most common linguistic barriers, and also known as what are the languages that are most commonly spoken that are in families and households that are not English speaking. So this is a linguistic isolation tool, and it's used for engagement. We have some other ideas for engagement, but we haven't built those out yet. We also have a team. This now includes, you can replace my name with Nick Martirano. He's now the co-chair of this racial equity data team, and you can reach out to either one of us if you want to learn more about that. So I'm going to shift gears real quick one more time and leave you with some thoughts and then open it up for dialogue. This is a preview of a talk that I'm preparing later this year, celebrating and reflecting on the Clean Water Act at age 50. And so in my experience, I wanted to make sure that we're being honest about this and not just talking about what a great thing the Clean Water Act is and how great it is to sort of keep it the way it's been going. And so with that in mind, I'm going to make us think about a few things and recognize that from the community's perspective, by continuing to talk about these programs in their statutory silos, we're actually just kind of perpetuating some of this inequity that was designed in many cases. It was intended, if you think about it, the public's view of us, if you tell them that we work on clean water in the environment, and it's under this program called the Clean Water Act, and then we also work on drinking water, and it's called the Safe Affordable Drinking Water Act, or whatever. The differences, though, of those two programs is huge. If you understand the nuances of how both the systems design of legal statutory authorities, as well as the data that we collect and who our audiences are and who we spend our time with, they're very different from each other, and let alone from the maybe not aligned with the interests of the communities. And so I think, we owe it to ourselves to celebrate the Clean Water Act at 50, but we also really owe it to ourselves to reflect on, are we perpetuating some of these inequities by simply keeping these programs in their silos and keeping the data in the wheelhouse of what the original program was meant to do? So, yes, the Clean Water Act was done by some brilliant work, and it actually, if you hear the architects of it speak, they'll kind of brag about the fact that California started this with the Port of Cologne work, and then took that work to Congress and found a willing audience within both the executive branch and the leg branch to advance this into a statute that Nixon signed, right? So all that great stuff happened. There was a lot of opportunity for community interest to be reflected, but you think about it, who has the opportunity to advocate with lobbyists? It's going to be the communities that have the power at the time and the money. And so there's a lot of voice in the community that was not reflected in the early crafting of the Clean Water Act. And then over time, it was actually, the work was put on the burden, the shoulders of these local governments, and many of them don't have the resources, and I don't mean the money, they don't have the wherewithal and the legal authority to create a sustainable cash flow to keep their local governments and these systems and utilities in place. And there's this gross inequity that goes back to the idea of housing and redlining, that some of these neighborhoods generate more taxes than others, and they're going to get more services. And so there's this really interesting sort of thread that you start pulling on, and it comes out of the Clean Water Act, and it's called this racial equity thread. So there's a lot of success too that's not talked about in many cases. So I have a slide that talks about the unlikely heroes and sheroes of the Clean Water Act. I grew up as a son of a professor of water limnology and water civil, they called it sanitary engineering, in the early 70s. He taught at Utah State and Humboldt State. And he also taught treatment plant operators. He spent many years going on weekends and other side classes to make sure that operators around the country were using good technologies and best practices and knowing how to work in their laboratories and all those things. All that work that was put into place, all those people come to mind. When I think of the Clean Water Act, I think of it as one of the most expansive social projects to change society and civilization in a very short turnaround. In a matter of decades, they took a massive water pollution problem across the country and they started solving it. And they did it by mobilizing regular people. The lawyers and the other sort of consulting firms that made a lot of money should be recognized, but I want to make sure that we talk about the civil servants, the people that are like building and maintaining these collection systems, the environmental groups that are collecting citizen monitoring data today, to this day, maybe multi-generational efforts that would be really interesting to sort of like highlight of, you know, kids of grandparents who started a monitoring program that are still out there collecting data and turning advocacy. Third-party lawsuits are absolutely important part of the driver and designed in. And then, of course, all of you. And so this is kind of like my charge to us is that because the Clean Water Act doesn't live in a vacuum and this data that we're collecting is what's going to live on, we owe it to ourselves to sort of think about the data that we collect and to make sure that we're not perpetuating these context barriers to where people, you know, they can get the data, but to make any sense of it, they have to go through like a web page that has like a info@wqx.gov or something like that as an email. And then finally they get to somebody who can maybe try to explain it. And so are we doing a disservice by putting out these barriers? The data itself should be considered public and we should get it out there, but we should do it in a way that's thoughtful, because at the end of the day, it's really that sticks around. I've had the benefit and really lucky to have a great career and been here a long time, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the data. You know, what I'm going to be most happy about, if anything, is that we put more data out there than was there before we started this work in our office. And because that is what's going to make a difference. People are going to take that, they're going to reuse it multiple times, they're going to fix it, they're going to clean up that data, and it's really the data that tells the story. So I think with that, I'll pause.
Thank you so much, Greg, for your excellent presentation. Yeah, and I really appreciate how you ended it with the Clean Water Act and sort of these hidden inequities that I have not even thought about. So thank you for bringing that up. So right now we have a few minutes for questions. So I invite anyone to ask. Greg, any questions you may have, feel free to raise your hand using the reactions at the bottom. Or you can just unmute, or another way is to type your question in the chat box. So while we wait for anyone to ask questions, Greg, I was really interested in how you were talking about systems level change. And I was wondering, you know, how does that happen? Is it more of a ground up kind of grassroots thing, or at some point, you know, there must be some involvement with folks at the top, like the top level managers and supervisors of institutions, right? So how does that get happening? Like, how do you get that started?
Carefully, no. I think I break it into two steps. One is understanding, like being able to see systems is vital. So like if you think about it like in an ecosystem example, you know, like understanding that there's agents out there that are in feedback loops, and they're driving other systems because of their agency and their need for that feedback loop. So like things that eat other things or things that are food for other things. I don't want to say that I don't want to take that food analogy too far in the government workplace context, but it's the same sort of model. It's agents and feedback loops that turn into these drivers. And so if you can see that, you know, for example, consultants have an important role to play in the advancement of the Clean Water Act. Consultants, we can't make them go away. We wouldn't want to do that. But really looking at that system and understanding it allows you to sort of, as an agent of change yourself, how do you design your interventions? Like you could beat your head against the wall if you go directly into a feedback loop against a really powerful agent, right? And so like just being able to navigate as a leader of change is informed well by systems thinking. And then advocating within your organization for doing things that are at a system level that's strategic. So that once you sort of have this idea of a map, and your agency or your department is facing this first question of let's adopt a resolution and we're going to do a bunch of really cool work, what they choose to do and how they choose to do it could be well informed by these systems ideas. And so the strategies have a better chance of success. The other kind of systems thinking mindset to sort of keep in mind here is monitor, 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 because we're part of the system ourselves, but that's one of the things that we can help build as monitoring advocates, is not just water quality monitoring, but making progress. Are we changing these things that we think are going to be important for actually delivering different outcomes?
Thank you. And I see that Nick has added a few resources in the chat. Please check those out. See a comment here from Susan. Thank you for sharing this treasure trove of resources in addition to thought-provoking perspective. I would totally agree with that. I don't see any hands raised. Does anyone want to unmute?
You guys can ask me anything. Like, let's get in the weeds on.
Yeah.
You can ask me something about, like, we're doing work on trying to advance this with tribes in water quality topics, harmful algal blooms and bioaccumulation projects in particular. So, like, we can go in a lot of directions that I didn't talk about too.
I was going to ask a question. You'd mentioned in the pollution and prejudice section that there were some analyses that you didn't get into, but I was wondering if you could highlight, or maybe somebody else could speak of some of the highlights of those analyses.
I'll start it and ask Jamie to really fill it in. But the basic analysis was done in a GIS context because there are shapes. So we have census tracts that have CalENVIRO screen data in them. And then we had shapes of redlining that are polygons that had the original sort of grades. And so there was this, a lot of discussion at one point to sort of renormalize the CalENVIRO screen data so that it was ranked on a city basis instead of a statewide. But then once you had these sort of different shapes and different scores, there was some more detailed analytics that I'll let Jamie describe.
Good description, Greg. So I think Nick had put in the link to it earlier. I would suggest you read through the steps that one of Greg's staff, David, actually did to get to that point. And I think you could do the same with maybe US EPA EJ screen data as well, since that is much more national. This one is only for California.
We stopped short. So the analysis shows association, and we had a lot of discussions about, at the end of the day, can you really say that there's like a correlation between historic redlining categories or scores and current environmental pollution outcomes? And, for multiple reasons, we stopped short of that. One was, we're not, CalENVIRO screen is a growth process, and we're not 100% sure that all the indicator areas are as robust as some of the others. Like air is really strong in some ways, even though I think some of the air EJ advocates in California would disagree with my statement. But you compare it to the water indicators in there, and we had like a couple that were violations of MCLs and this impaired water body thing, and maybe some other things that were kind of water related. And so, like, it was really hard to say, is that really a correlation at that point? Plus, there's a lot of factors that go into the bringing to today the redlining data sets, because in many cases they were baked in with hard barriers like rail lines and freeways and other things, and other examples in California. They've changed quite a bit. Some areas are just as segregated as they were in 1968. Some are not. They've changed quite a bit. So there's a lot of factors that we had to consider in trying to make conclusions.
Great, thank you.
And it is all open source and really well described. It's really cool. So for people who want to get more into that part, it's all there.
Appreciate it.
All right, so there's a question in the chat. It's actually a little bit more general, but maybe also related to California. Are the National Water Quality Monitoring Council, JEDI, and the CWQMC JEDI groups different? And if so, how do they work together to achieve common goals? The Their logos are strikingly similar. I can only speak about the national one. You know, we're very new, and we have Nick as a council member representing the region. So Nick is what's the person in common.
I'll say that the national group is much farther along than the California group, Shelley. California, I mean, as far as meeting and meeting regularly and creating some products. Sylvia took the lead on getting up a hero page dedicated to JEDI resources, which I contribute a lot to, and the team at CalEPA contributes a lot to. We hope that the California group, as it gets off the ground, and we're looking to have our first meeting in the next month or so, and have some leadership there, can coordinate more closely. But yeah, I mean, I'm a common conduit, so we'll be looking to work together.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I see Dwayne Young has his hand up. Please unmute.
Great. Hey, Greg, great presentation. Hey. It's always good to hear your work. So I did have a question. Do you have any advice or pitfalls to avoid or anything like that in developing environmental indicators? That's something we're really starting to think about for EJ screen from water, and it's hard. It's really difficult, and it looks like you've been somewhat successful in that space. I'm curious, do you have some advice as we wade into that?
It's great to see you, Dwayne, and always recognize your amazing work as well. We have not made a lot of progress. I would say we're in the initial stages, and one of the ways that we're trying to approach this is understanding that to do this work effectively, it can't just be a scientific exercise. We have to involve community. So we're starting with tribal in California as being like a focal, a way to sort of prioritize, because there's just too much to do in California. And so, but that does sort of follow this idea of most vulnerable and overburdened. And when you go to the tribes, just had a meeting today, talking with some representatives, and you start asking them about what data do they want to see, what are their interests, what are their, where are they coming from in their terms of important health priorities or important things to advocate for with the environment, what do they want to see? And once you start to sort of bake that out, you'll probably realize that most of what they want is a gap. We don't really have a lot of data. So, but it's a really important way to do that, because otherwise you build an indicator based on what you have. And you often find historically, and you know this already, you find that it doesn't align with the interests of the communities that you think you're trying to serve. So we're trying to just be really intentional this time and start with that community lens, and we're starting with tribes. And I'll let you know how it goes, but I can tell you harmful algal blooms is probably a common thing across the country. This idea of safe to eat or exposure by way of legacy pollutants, or even not legacy pollutants like cyanotoxins in some cases, how do they sort of come into their exposure pathways, whether it's cultural practices like we would call swimming and bathing, or would it be something more like eating? And maybe it's a little bit of both, because they spend time gathering basket material and wading in areas. And so there's a lot of this stuff that we're actually trying to document. Research has been done, but that first step to me is really getting that community lens right, and then design the indicators. And if there's gaps, then start collecting the data if you can.
Very helpful. Thanks, Greg.
Next, we have Susan.
Hi, sorry, I can't seem to get my camera to work, but I'm just going to focus on the voice. Thanks so much, Greg. This was really an inspiring presentation. And as I mentioned, looks like you guys have already pulled together a treasure trove of resources that I'm hoping we may be able to repurpose with credits, of course. A couple of areas that the work group, the National Water Quality Monitoring Council JEDI work group is interested in, and area that we're interested in the Office of Water. So one is trying to develop, when you talk about developing the workforce, one of the things that Sylvia and others who are leading the work group have talked about is, kind of building the capacity so that we've got more people coming to conferences representing a broad spectrum of experiences and racial and other backgrounds. Any insights on how to help develop that workforce, working with volunteer monitoring communities and schools. We're looking for pieces like that people are trying and finding some success with and some interest. And then another thing we're wondering about is to look for examples of points to share with communities and monitoring organizations on how to kind of look at monitoring and data collection through an EJ lens. So thinking about where have we not monitored, or where have we distributed monitoring resources equitably? How do we look at that and work that into our plans as we move forward?
There's a lot there, and I'll do my normal dance of we don't really have the answers. It may look like we're out ahead, but we're just doing what we can in California, and we're learning and being led by the community as many ways as we're doing any leadership on our own. So the community, we're kind of blessed, I guess, in the sense that California has some very active and experienced advocates in the community as well, from the monitoring lens, as well as just getting outcomes and learning what works and what doesn't work. So, but there's a lot of commonality across the country. We had some statutory energy recently around both harmful algal blooms and inland swimming in California. And the data gaps there are shocking. When we got back to the legislature, it would cost probably $1 billion annually to do the kind of inland swimming water quality monitoring that's done in beaches in California. They kind of choked and they said, well, why don't you think about it? Here's $200,000 to think about it and tell us what would be a better way to prioritize that number so that it's not $1 billion of monitoring. But if you ask people in California where they swim and why, or would they swim somewhere if they knew more information? We had in our preparatory work for the legislation, we had data showing that shocking number of people of color drown in sloughs and canals in California. And, it may not be a water quality linkage, which I heard a lot when we talked about it. But when you ask the community, do you feel like you could swim around where you go? And, a lot of people in the Bay Area, they go to Tahoe to swim at their cabin, right? So there's not the same pathways to equitable, safe swimming for everyone in California. And that's absolutely universal, I bet, across the country. So I think there's ways to sort of take the work that we all do and to really put these lenses on that are not hard. Like it's not a stretch to think that people would in the summer anywhere in the United States would want a place that's safe to swim. And how do we communicate that better with the data that we have and the data that we don't have? So I think, and then the workforce part, I think I've found as a practitioner for 3 years and now I'm a certified teacher on the racial equity. The content that we develop that goes into this it can be covered in a couple hours or 6 hours, preferably 6 hours. But even if you had community groups that wanted to partner with you, it might be helpful to ground on this. You're not teaching them how to do racial equity work. I wouldn't presume that you're going to take that voice. But by having this conversation together, you can really start to form these relationships with the community groups and your government entities that are doing the monitoring work. That's going to be more trust-based because you're using common language. And you may find that even produces pipelines of workforce, because now you've got people that see, hey, I can do that and get paid. I have to go to school, but whatever. You can maybe change some of these systems too.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, and everyone. It's been a really great dialogue. That hour went by really fast. So I hope we can meet again and continue the dialogue. Our next webinar is planned for April 4th. I put some information in the chat. And then I also added back the links I shared from the top of the hour in case you missed it or came in a little bit later. So yeah, we really appreciate everyone's time, and Once again, I thank the speakers and Nick and Jamie for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week. We'll make this recording available to you as soon as possible. Thank you
Thanks so
very
much,
much.
Greg. Thanks, Sylvia.